AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry and literally billions of dollars are being invested, so buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/bandwidth. That's oracle.com/bandwidth. oracle.com/bandwidth.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to New Books in Irish Studies, a podcast channel in the New Books Network. My name is Aidan Beattie. I'm one of the co-hosts of this channel. Today we're talking to Dr. Elizabeth DeYoung, a research scientist and lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, she co-leads research initiatives on basic income at a national scale at the university's Centre for Guaranteed Income Research. And prior to her appointment there, Dr. DeYoung was awarded a Mellon ACLS Public Postdoctoral Fellowship and led social policy research initiatives at the Reinvestment Fund in Philadelphia. She earned a PhD at the Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool, where her doctoral work focused on post-conflict politics and planning in Northern Ireland. She also received an MA in Irish Studies from Queen's University Belfast and a BA in International Affairs and Modern Languages from Northeastern University in Boston. Dr. DeYoung has authored several peer-reviewed publications, and her first book, Power, Politics and Territory in the New Northern Ireland, has just been released by Liverpool University Press. It's obviously that book that we're here to talk about today. Dr. DeYoung, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction.
Sure. So I might jump right in with a very specific question about your book. You focus a lot on a place called Girdwood Barracks. I'm much more a historian of the Republic of Ireland rather than Northern Ireland. So it's not totally embarrassing to say I'd never heard of Girdwood Barracks. I had no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, a lot of people haven't. So
Sure. So maybe just tell us what it is and why it matters, why it's important.
Sure, absolutely. So the Girdwood Barracks, they were the main army barracks in North Belfast during the Troubles. So really a central site of conflict. And they're located in a part of North Belfast that bore witness to countless atrocities. You had sectarian murders of civilians and riots and raids and constant surveillance by the British Army. You had houses burnt out in this area. And so this patch of land, it's about 27 acres, and it's extremely contested. It functions, if you're looking at a map of Belfast, it functions as an effective buffer zone between these neighborhoods that are highly divided by ethno-national identity. It sits right in the middle of several interfaces, which are places where contested territories meet. So on one side, you have, for instance, the Catholic nationalist New Lodge area and the Protestant Unionist Lower Shankill, and those are divided by a roundabout. I wish I was writing this down for you. On the other side, you have the Protestant Unionist Lower Old Park neighborhood, and that's divided by an actual peace wall, a metal barrier, from the Catholic nationalist Lower Cliftonville. And so for these 4 neighborhoods, the way that they're divided and the way that the barracks functions as a buffer is really stark. And these neighborhoods are divided by ethno-national identity and really traumatized by decades of violent conflict. But they have a lot in common. They all, year on year feature at the top of the multiple deprivation index, have really high rates of unemployment and extremely low levels of physical and mental health, high levels of food insecurity. North Belfast, critically, for a long time, has experienced a housing crisis, particularly among the nationalist Catholic population. And so I say all this to kind of introduce that back in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, when this huge parcel of land, the Army Barracks, was demilitarized, it offered this enormous opportunity for North Belfast and these four neighborhoods that had been, marginalized and ignored and traumatized. And so the barracks site really was lauded as having huge potential. There were, innovative regeneration plans and visions from politicians and community groups that this would be an internationally significant site, that it would provide the peace dividend for areas that desperately needed it, and it would serve as a catalyst for peace building. This is a symbolic transformation of a site of conflict to a site of reconciliation. And you have 27 acres of land as well to support social housing in an area with a real need for it. So it really felt like the Girdwood Barracks were a boon for, post-agreement Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, this has not happened. It's, over 11 years and 11.7 million pounds of peacebuilding money. The politicians involved in the site, the DUP and Sinn Féin, to name them, were ultimately unable to agree on any kind of thoughtful redevelopment of the space. And, what happened was they ignored the prescriptions of the Good Friday Agreement throughout the development process. They ignored really fantastic organizing work that had been done at the community level, and they refused to provide adequate housing for an area in crisis. And so the whole enterprise became this kind of tit-for-tat, zero-sum carve-up. The result today, if you go to the Girdwood Barracks site, is a community hub. It's a leisure center. It has a sports pitch. It has 60 houses towards the back of the site. And it's a real white elephant of a building. It really does not do anything for the surrounding area. And it just effectively reinscribes all of those physical divisions I talked about earlier. So Girdwood, I think, is really important because it's not only the story of a missed opportunity for North Belfast and really for Northern Ireland, but it's a microcosm of the peace process and how it unfolded. You had the hopeful aspirations of the agreement, and these were ultimately obscured by the power dynamics between the DUP and Sinn Féin and the tit-for-tat kind of zero-sum resource competition that eventually caused the assembly to collapse. There's still not a working government in Northern Ireland today. And so, I think Girdwood is a fascinating study on its own, but also an allegory for the peace process itself.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I was thinking as I was reading your book was, like, in a normal society, right? Normal in scare quotes. In a normal society, something like this would be just snapped up by any working class community, right? If there was 27 acres all of a sudden that just became available for social housing in Dublin, everyone would be clamoring to get it. And obviously, as you're describing, the opposite happened. There's almost like a resistance to doing anything with it. And I was kind of wondering, like, given that this is would have been a boon for working class communities in North Belfast, what role does class play in the kind of stuff that you're studying? And what do you think class even looks like in Northern Ireland? How much does it get skewed by all these other forms of identity that are swirling around?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because it's easy to kind of just devolve into the orange and green when we talk about Northern Ireland, but class is so critical to, I think, any analysis. And particularly when you're looking at redevelopment and investment, you can see in Belfast that, and I'll just speak to Belfast, because Northern Ireland as a whole, I worked in Belfast particularly, but investment has really only taken place in spaces that were unproblematic to begin with. And these tend to be places that are more middle class, who were, perhaps buffered a little bit from the conflict, the worst of the conflict. So, if you take South Belfast and East Belfast, for instance, Northern Ireland alone has spent over 150 million pound there, compared to approximately 40 million in West and North. And so the former, include post-industrial areas that are less working class are a little bit, better off. And the West and North are the places that were hit the hardest by conflict and that have those sectarian fault lines to contend with. In the book, for instance, a little known fact that Prony was actually once a possibility for the Girdwood site, and the advisory forum had tendered for it, but they didn't get it, and it went to the Titanic Quarter instead, which was, kind of a more unproblematic space for development. And, it's understandable in some respects, but, I often walk Belfast, and something that always really infuriated me was this idea that academic Brendan Murda terms it the twin speed city, where the outskirts of Belfast, the West and the North, and the parts that are kind of cut off from the city center by the motorway are excluded from the relative prosperity of the center and kind of the new Belfast, as it were. And it's so clear, when you're on foot and you're walking from, say, North Belfast into the center. I remember feeling such a clear divide walking back from North Belfast and some kind of, grim environments. And, in 10 minutes, you cross over the motorway and you're in city center, and it's a different world. And you've got tourists and cocktail bars and the after work crowd. And it might be a little different now, I think, with the impact of the pandemic, but it really felt like there were two Belfasts, and one was getting the investment and the tourism, and the other had kind of been pushed to the side. And I think all cities are like that in a sense. You always have these class divides, but it feels particularly potent in Belfast.
So I might maybe ask you to talk a little bit more about that thing of walking, because it's something you obviously talk about quite a bit in the book. It's like, that's almost like your methodology of just wandering around the city and seeing what you can find. How did you, I guess, walk into that? How did you end up taking up that as your methodology? And what does it do for you that other methods wouldn't do?
Yes, I love walking. It's absolutely my methodology. And, I've worn out many pairs of Doc Martens in my endeavors. I believe it offers so many opportunities as a researcher, as a human, to just explore and truly experience places. So when I first moved to Belfast, I was 20 years old. I was a student, and I just walked everywhere. I just wandered the city aimlessly, and I went, up the falls and down the Shankill and through Sailor Town and the New Lodge. And some of it was solitary. I love moving through spaces alone and just paying close attention to what's visible and what's not, and the presence of absence in places, which I think, in places that have been affected by conflict can feel really powerful. I don't know if that's the right word. Sometimes I would walk and I would look for particular memorial plaques or markings that had denoted where something had happened during the conflict. And I would try to, kind of piece together stories from the past through walking the present. And I became really drawn to how, memory and emotion are wrapped up in how people make sense of place. I loved paying attention to the mood of spaces and, just observing the neighborhoods and the chip shops and the petrol stations and the vacant lots and eavesdropping on people as I walked. You can really get a sense of a place through it. And I think, I could talk forever about this. I'll try to, keep it short, but it's really interesting walking a place like Belfast because, you can note the power dynamics of a place. Some murals, for instance, can be a barometer of local opinion and who's in control of a neighborhood. For instance, Tigers Bay, I remember, had a mural. I think it had been funded, by a peace program or something. And then that was painted over when a different faction of paramilitaries took over. So you can tell different allegiances by who's had a hand in building the memorial gardens and painting the murals. You can see where, investment has been directed. And so walking was really the first step to understanding Belfast. It's such a complex place geographically, and it has all these visible and invisible barriers and walls and obstacles. And, I guess it's difficult to classify myself, but I say as an anthropologist, there's value in being in a space physically and learning from your surroundings and physically navigating, what it's like to move through these divided areas and to feel awkward and nervous and, to get lost along the way. And so, the environment is so important to my research practice.
I mean, there's something you mentioned there that I think is something I struggled with your book, but it struggled with in a good way, of not being able to figure out what discipline is this person working in? Like, is this anthropology? Is it geography? Or is the answer just what you're doing is just Irish studies?
Yeah, honestly, I have always struggled to define my work this is a tough word, disciplinarily. I lean towards anthropology because I've always been interested in people. I've always been happy sitting to the side, observing people, and, in an intellectual sense, exploring why people behave and believe and interact the ways that they do. But then that kind of brings me into geography because I want to know, how do these behaviors and beliefs shape and reflect our surroundings, and how do people and place exist in this kind of mutually constitutive relationship where each shapes the other. And then I find myself a little bit in history because I'm like, how does that change over time? And, how do our surroundings reflect these shifting political and social and economic dynamics? I would say, and I don't think you can study Northern Ireland without immersing yourself in the past, if only as a mooring point, because, the past still very much lives in the present in the North, in the way that I think identity is formed and shaped and understood. So that's, kind of a meandering way of saying that I struggle to define myself. I think something that I've always wanted to do with my work is using qualitative methods to bridge the academic and the applied worlds, and to bring to bear stories that have real import and consequence for policymaking and space shaping and community building. I really love listening to people, and I feel grateful that the people in the book shared their stories and their time with me. I'm not an activist, but I've been lucky to research alongside activists and advocates and residents who are identifying these really clear social injustices and moving forward important conversations. And so, I wanted to not only document their work, but highlight it and just kind of contribute in my own small way by writing the Girdwood story. So I never wanted my research to stay in the ivory tower, and I've never felt quite comfortable there. And I think that's why I've kind of moved a little bit into the field that I'm currently in, which is much more applied.
So I might kind of go into that thing you're saying of the past living in the present still in Northern Ireland. And your book, the subtitle of it describes it as being a study of the new Northern Ireland, but that's in scare quotes, which I assume is intentional. So what exactly is new here? How much does the past still stay the same? How much is future oriented? I guess why the scare quotes, I guess, is the question I'm really asking.
Yes, the scare quotes. I think there's a couple different reasons I gravitated towards the scare quotes. I think, the narrative of the new Northern Ireland in terms of politics, it's frustrating, I think, to hear sometimes that, Northern Ireland is sorted, because it's just so complicated. I think the peace process created the space and the architecture for an alternative future in Northern Ireland. And I never want to denigrate that. Of course, things are better than they were. But in practice, the aspirations of the agreement have been subverted by identity politics, and in particular, naming the DUP and Sinn Féin. They are, perhaps the villains of this book in a way, because I think in practice, what's happened is the same dynamics that fueled the conflict, the opposing identities and the territorial claim and just fighting over access to resources, it's just moved into the corridors of Stormont. So, the root causes of the violence are were really just being expressed through the medium of politics as the DUP and Sinn Féin moved into power sharing. And you see this in the way that they made policy, in the way that they changed community relations strategies, in the way that they directed funding to, different areas and groups based on their, I guess, political agendas. And you see it in the way that spaces like the Girdwood Hub have been built, which just reinforced division, did nothing transformative for space or society. And so, I guess I use the scare quotes. It kind of riles me up when I think about this, and I think about the way that politics hasn't really changed and the way that that impacts people. In everyday life, you have people still on the waiting list for housing, living in these unsafe conditions and struggling in so many ways. And the politicians have just abdicated responsibility for supporting people and making good, rational policy. So when we do talk about a new Northern Ireland, and I think there are, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There are brilliant things happening, but the politicians really haven't had much to do with moving that along, and they haven't led. And I don't really think they should be able to pat themselves on the back, because it's despite them and not because of them that things, on the ground continue to chug along and move forward.
So over the years that you have been going to Northern Ireland, what do you think has really changed? Like, what is genuinely new?
Well, I think, I guess an obvious answer is the new Northern Ireland under the tourist gaze. I think in some ways the rebranding of Northern Ireland with Titanic and Game of Thrones has been a real success. It's brought jobs and economic growth and a sense of normalcy to Belfast. So I've certainly noticed that. But again, thinking about the class, as we mentioned earlier, it does still exclude people a little bit. Like I note that the price of admission to the Titanic experience, for instance, it's still £19 for concession. And, a lot of people who live near the old shipyards and whose, families probably built the Titanic, they can't afford that. I think on the other hand, though, when I was just back in Belfast during the summer and went out with some friends to a new, I forget the name of it, but there's been some really cool redevelopment in terms of like taking old spaces like warehouses and mills, converting them into artist and musician studios, small businesses, markets. I think, there's a lot of really cool things happening in Belfast, and there's always been something that I've always loved about Belfast is there's a sense of creativity and there's so much talent in the city. And so I think, there has been more room for that to expand as well as the years move on. So I hope that answers your question.
Sure. There's something you said at the very start that I think is absolutely correct, of like the tendency people often have to only view Northern Ireland in these like stark binaries of Protestant and Catholic. And you point out at the end of your book that there are these increasing numbers of people in Northern Ireland who just, in effect, opt out of these categories. They opt out of a sectarian conception of politics. So, for instance, at the most recent election, I think it was something like 20% of Northern Irish voters just don't vote for either overtly Catholic or overtly Protestant parties, right? They vote for the Alliance Party or People Before Profit or the Green Party. Can I just ask you to tell us more about that, where maybe you see it going in the future?
Sure. I think you're right. I think, the last couple of elections, it started, in 2016 when I remember People Before Profit had this incredible landslide win in West Belfast, which had traditionally been Sinn Féin territory. And I think that was indicative of the fact that, for quite some time, it had been that the DUP and Sinn Féin were in this relationship of mutual accommodation, where Sinn Féin would often kind of acquiesce to the DUP to keep things running smoothly and kind of keep things, working. to some extent, but eventually that collapsed because people were getting frustrated. They weren't seeing, housing. They weren't seeing movement on minority language rights for the Irish language. They weren't seeing, what Sinn Féin had promised to their electorate. And so I think the first kind of shift was that 2016 election. And, then the assembly collapsed and it's collapsed again. And I think, with each collapse, it's almost laughable, but I think people are just my sense is that people are totally fed up. I think as the assembly has continued to fail, that people are increasingly more concerned with just the bread and butter issues. We've lived through a pandemic and record inflation, and the NHS is crumbling, and identity politics just doesn't seem as relevant. And I think that it feels, and again, I haven't researched in Belfast as recently, but it seems to me just as an observer that the politicians are really ill-equipped to fill this space. And so other kind of movements and activists and parties have filled the vacuum that they've left. And I think that's been a really good thing. I think, even when I lived in Belfast, I had a sense that most people were just getting along and living life. There was a lot of, going to work and school and the pub and making music and just a lot of humor. It was, it wasn't that the orange and green affected everything in life. But anyway, I do see a shift in politics, and I think there's a lot of scope for research on how that's changing and which groups might be changing. And I definitely think that's ongoing. That's like a new pathway.
Sure. So do you think you'll stay working on Northern Ireland, or where do you plan to go next as a researcher?
I've always loved, I miss Belfast so much. I'm currently based in Philly. And I'm working in a very different space at the minute, very different research, but with potential ties to Northern Ireland. So I'm currently a research lead at the Center for Guaranteed Income Research, as you mentioned, at Penn, and we're involved in evaluating experiments that are happening across the country here, where cities are piloting the idea of a basic income. And so it's this idea of giving people unconditional cash transfers, no strings attached, every month, and seeing what happens. And so, we've been working here in the States on a national level and kind of building an evidence base here, but we're really keen to kind of make connections now on an international scale and work with this kind of network of researchers who are exploring basic income worldwide. And so, I think the idea of a basic income in a post-conflict context, particularly for those who have not received the so-called peace dividend, has real potential. I think there's a lot of really cool work going on in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, the UK, around alternative economies, and how do we think differently about money and value in a world that, capitalism isn't really serving us. So I think there are some really cool connections that I'm going to try to explore so that I can get back over to Belfast.
Wonderful. Well, Power, Politics and Territory in the new Northern Ireland, I believe, is just out, right? It has just been released?
Yeah, okay. Last week.
Great. Well, it's out now with Liverpool University Press and is well worth reading. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. DeYoung.
Thank you so much for having me.